One was a rank outsider who reluctantly took over as the president of his country. But once he tasted power, he ensured that he stayed in power without any opposition. The other chose to be part of the system that had impacted his own family, slowly climbing through the ranks to get the top job of the president of his country. But once in power, he too ensured that he stayed in power for life. Welcome to The Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we take a look at the two most powerful authoritarian figures in current times, Russia's Vladimir Putin and China's Xi Jinping. Russia's Vladimir Putin can be considered an outsider because he came from a working class family. And like any ordinary citizen, he took the path of education to get to a better life. Putin studied law at the Leningrad State University and after graduation joined the Soviet spy agency, the KGB. In December of 1989, Putin witnessed the collapse of the Soviet control in Europe when angry crowds converged upon the KGB headquarters in Dresden, Germany. Putin asked for help from Moscow, but the response he got was, "Moscow is silent." And this incident had a huge impact upon him because he felt like one of the most powerful empires had suddenly disappeared. Though he seemed to have seen the writing on the wall with respect to the collapse of Soviet power in Europe, but he expected something else to rise in the place of the Soviet Union. To him, it felt like the Soviets dropped everything and just went away. Subsequently, Putin returned to Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, in 1990, and there he started his political career. Putin became an aide to Anatoly Sobchak, who was the mayor of St. Petersburg. Incidentally, Sobchak was his professor at University of Leningrad. As an aide to Sobchak, Putin maintained a low profile, but he was still the go-to guy for Sobchak. And many say that Putin got his authoritarian tendencies from Sobchak. After Sobchak lost his re-election bid, Putin and his family moved to Moscow, and that is where Putin slowly started climbing up the ladder in the political circle, and this culminated in him becoming the head of KGB's successor organization, the FSB, in 1998. And as the head of the FSB, Putin had a direct line of communication with Russian President Boris Yeltsin. But after he was made the secretary of the influential Security Council, Vladimir Putin became part of the inner circle of Boris Yeltsin. Towards the end of 1998, the Russian economy was going downhill and Boris Yeltsin looked visibly ill. So there was a lot of talk about who was going to be the next president. And many felt that his deputy prime minister, Boris Nemtsov, would be the right successor to Yeltsin. However, Nemtsov had opposed Yeltsin's 1994-96 war in Chechnya to suppress the rebellion, so Yeltsin did not look too favorably at him. So he preferred the non-controversial but virtually unknown to public Vladimir Putin and appointed him prime minister in August of 1999. Appointing Vladimir Putin prime minister was easy, but to have him win an election was going to be very difficult when people hardly knew anything about him. So Boris Yeltsin's advisors came up with a plan. And the plan was to have Yeltsin step down from presidency prematurely, and that would make Vladimir Putin an acting president, which would give him enough face time with the public before the March 2000 elections. The strategy worked. In a surprise announcement on New Year's Eve 1999, Boris Yeltsin announced his resignation and the appointment of Vladimir Putin as acting president. Vladimir Putin went on to win the election with a 53% vote and was formally inaugurated as president in May of 2000. Now, there were two things that really worked well for Putin. One was because he was a rank outsider, not a well-known political figure, there was not much data to criticize him upon. And from an optics perspective, he was the exact opposite of the outgoing President Boris Yeltsin. Putin was young, energetic, soft-spoken, yet firm. One of the great attributes of powerful people around the globe is that they never lay all the cards on the table in one go. And that is exactly what Putin did. The world did not know who he was, and he exposed himself slowly, in installments, over the course of his tenure. So Bill Clinton felt that he was low-key and soft-spoken. George W. Bush felt he had been able to look into Putin's soul. But Barack Obama felt that Putin was always ruthless. Vladimir Putin's first job as the president of Russia was to pull the economy out of the mess that it was in. And for that, he needed foreign investment. That meant he had to reach out to the West. And he did that in style, mentioning the possibility of Russian membership of NATO to President Bill Clinton in 2000. Yes, that's exactly what he suggested, though that idea did not go anywhere. He maintained the Russian Partnership Agreement signed with the European Union in 1994, and a NATO-Russian Council was established in 2002. On the domestic front, in his first address as Russia's president, Putin promised to protect freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and property rights, and he reaffirmed his commitment to democracy. Democracy meant that he was not going to be the president forever. And with that in mind, he tried to figure out a way that he could boost his compensation without really making it official. He was from a humble background, and he did not want to retire penniless or living an ordinary life. He wanted to retire in luxury. And the best place to look for money in Russia was where it was actually concentrated: the oligarchs. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, by 1996, the Russian government was in financial dire straits. And to overcome the tax revenue deficit, President Yeltsin borrowed the ruble equivalent of about $1.8 billion from a handful of individuals and offered them as collateral shares in the crown jewels of the Russian industry and natural resources. And subsequently, this group was able to win these assets in a series of rigged auctions. And this group, with full ownership of billions of dollars worth of Russian industrial assets, came to be known as the oligarchs. And their power and financial backing enabled Boris Yeltsin to win the second presidential term in 1996. So Putin started seizing the assets of these oligarchs and putting them behind bars on trumped-up charges, especially if they were threatening to be his political opponents. And to the rest of the oligarchs, he made it very clear they could continue to own their assets as long as they stayed out of politics. And the most prominent among the oligarchs to be arrested on trumped-up charges was Russia's richest man in 2004, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the CEO of oil giant Yukos. Interestingly, taking over the assets of the oligarchs ended up being very popular with the general Russian public because they had been very upset with the preferential treatment that had been given to the oligarchs with respect to ownership of industrial and natural assets. So with this move, Putin ended up accomplishing two things. One, asserting his control over Russia, and second, gaining in popularity with the electorate. But there was another reason why Putin was seizing the gas assets from the private sector. And the reason was that Putin felt that oil and gas constituted strategic assets, and these needed to be deployed strategically. That is, they needed to be in control of the government. And that is why the biggest gas company, Gazprom, and the second biggest, Yukos, came under direct governmental control, with Putin's close allies becoming CEOs of these companies. And knowing Europe's appetite for gas, Putin looked for a leader who could be potentially corrupted into a deal with Russia. And that leader was German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder. From the times of President John F. Kennedy, the US administration had tried hard to prevent Europe from building gas-carrying pipelines from Russia. But by 1970s and 1980s, two pipelines were constructed to supply natural gas to Germany from the West Siberian gas fields, one through Ukraine and the other through Poland. And Putin felt that having these pipelines run through Ukraine and Poland were not in strategic interests of Russia. That meant he was looking to construct a new pipeline through the Baltic Sea from Russia to Germany without passing through any other third country. The German company BASF provided the technology for building this pipeline, and on 9 December 2005, the Baltic Sea pipeline construction began. Baltic Sea Pipeline, aka Nord Stream 1. And just a few days after losing to Angela Merkel, Gerhard Schröder joined the board of Nord Stream 1 as its chief shareholder. And the timing was perfect, because just in late 2004, early 2005, Ukraine had witnessed the Orange Revolution, which had deposed Putin's ally and favored candidate Viktor Yanukovych as the president of Ukraine. So with the Nord Stream 1, Putin was ensuring the elimination of any dependency on Ukraine for the supply of natural gas to Germany. But the Orange Revolution was a huge setback for Putin, because he was trying to follow the Western model of installing allies across neighboring countries that held strategic importance to Russia. And right around this time, Putin the Authoritarian made his first appearance on the global stage. In October of 2006, Anna Politkovskaya, a journalist who was critical of Kremlin, was murdered in Moscow. And in November of 2006, another Kremlin critic, Alexander Litvinenko, who was a former intelligence agent and had dubbed Russia a mafia state, was killed in London, poisoned with a radioactive substance by Russian spies. And to eliminate all doubt with respect to his objectives, Vladimir Putin delivered a speech at the 2007 Munich Security Conference, accusing the United States of creating a unipolar world after the Cold War, with one center of authority, one center of force, and one center of decision-making. And back home too, Putin's authoritarian mindset had become clear, though he was still popular in certain segments of the electorate. So towards the 2008 presidential elections, one serious candidate suddenly emerged. Former world chess champion Garry Kasparov. Now, Kasparov is a huge celebrity in Russia. And it was very clear that if he stepped into the fray, Putin would be up against a serious challenger. Wait, wasn't Putin ineligible for re-election due to term limits in the Russian constitution? Yes, indeed. And that is why he had nominated a close ally who was virtually his puppet, Dmitry Medvedev, as the presidential candidate. The plan was for Dmitry Medvedev to become president and appoint Putin as the prime minister. And of course, the world knew who would be pulling the strings. So Kasparov had to be stopped, and this was accomplished by sabotaging all his electoral moves. Sometimes a venue was not available to get his supporters to provide signatures to nominate him, and sometimes no hotel was available to host fundraisers. In the end, Kasparov had to drop out. By the 2008 elections, it was clear that authoritarianism was back in Russia and Putin was there for the long term. And as expected, despite widespread protests, Vladimir Putin once again stepped into the office of presidency in May of 2012. An argument has often been put forth that Putin's aggressive stance has been just a counter to NATO's expansion. But we fail to remember that NATO does not force its way into member countries. It is the member countries who request membership of NATO. In fact, Ukraine has had to wait a long time to get the NATO membership. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, all the way through Boris Yeltsin's presidency, there was no new NATO membership sign-up. It was only after Vladimir Putin took office that 7 countries in 2004 joined NATO. And the reason was twofold. One, they were previous Soviet republics and had become democratic, so they identified more with Western Europe than Russia. And secondly, since they were small, they wanted to ensure that their democracies could last and not be threatened by Russia. And democracies coming up all around him is what makes Putin most paranoid, not NATO's expansion. Contrary to Vladimir Putin, China's Xi Jinping came from an elitist background. Xi Jinping's father had played a pivotal role in Mao Zedong's Long March in 1935, and once the communists came to power, Xi Jinping's father was appointed Secretary General of the State Council in 1959. And he stayed in office till 1962. And due to this position, Xi Jinping was given the title Princeling and sent to an elitist school. Through the course of Mao's reign, different officials at different times used to get purged based on different reasoning, from falling out with the administration to accusation of being capitalists. And in 1962, Xi Jinping's father was impacted and she was expelled from his elite school in Beijing and sent to work in the countryside. Now you would think that this incident would have had a profound impact on Xi's thought process with respect to the cult figure of Mao and the Communist Party overall in China. But it didn't. In fact, after Mao's death, Xi joined the Communist Party. His thought process was that the Communist Party was his sure-shot channel to power. But he noticed that there was a lot of political struggle within Beijing, so he moved out of Beijing and went to the provinces. And he kept moving through different provinces and slowly rising to power. He became mayor in one of the provinces and finally the governor of another province. He continued to move through various provinces and finally reached Shanghai and became the party secretary. China's Communist Party, or the CCP, has a very hierarchical structure, and at the top of the structure is the Central Committee. And the Central Committee is responsible for policy making. But even higher than the Central Committee is the Standing Committee, and this group comprises the central leadership, which is also responsible for the Central Military Commission. Essentially, this group is the equivalent of the US presidential cabinet. And in every CCP National Congress, the order in which the standing committee members arrive on stage is the order of the overall hierarchy within the cabinet. So the president will always be leading the group when they arrive on stage. So in the 2007 National Congress, Xi Jinping made his first appearance as a member of the standing committee under President Hu Jintao. And the interesting part was that he was chosen because he was thought to be less ambitious since he had worked in the provinces rather than in Beijing. Xi Jinping got the top spot in 2012 after Hu Jintao stepped down after having completed his term. Xi Jinping was a complete believer in Mao's philosophy. Yes, he was following the same guy who had imprisoned his father and thrown him into the countryside. Now, Xi Jinping followed the same strategy as Vladimir Putin, that is, consolidation of power, by sacking top officials and replacing them with his trusted ones. In his second term, 3 of the top standing committee members had close ties to Xi. And in 2021, Xi Jinping introduced a resolution that barred anyone from challenging his ideology. At that time, the world gave him the title Mao 2.0. But can he really be Mao 2.0? Well, Mao was able to maintain his grip over China by keeping his people impoverished. But China now is a booming capitalistic economy with fairly high standards of living. And Xi has already seen resistance to his authority during the zero COVID policy. There were widespread protests across the country which forced him to reverse the zero COVID policy. So in his third term, Xi Jinping may need to tread the thread of authoritarianism a little more delicately. And it is on that note that we end this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. Based on win percentage, who is rated as the most successful Test cricket captain in history? With a win percentage of 71.92, Australia's Steve Waugh is the most successful Test cricket captain in history. So the answer is D, Steve Waugh of Australia. Question for the current episode. Over the course of Vladimir Putin's tenure as Russia's leader, Russia has witnessed several assassinations of Putin's political opponents. Which ex-member of Boris Yeltsin's cabinet was shot dead near Kremlin? Was it A. Boris Nemtsov, B. Alexei Navalny, C. Mikhail Lesin, or D. Boris Berezovsky? Once again, of all the political assassinations conducted during Putin's tenure as Russia's leader, which ex-member of Boris Yeltsin's cabinet was shot dead near Kremlin? Was it A. Boris Nemtsov, B. Alexei Navalny, C. Mikhail Lesin, or D. Boris Berezovsky? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in the current episode. In the next episode, we'll take a look at various business scandals, from the Boeing 737 MAX to the Volkswagen diesel scandal. And we'll take a look at any patterns that emerge out of these scandals. Till then, stay safe and keep exploring the why in history.